Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Digital Leader Show, where we talk key issues and news at the intersection of business and technology in hopes of making you a better digital leader. Hosted by Dan Goodstein and ERPA AI, a professional association, media and peer research network, providing education, networking and advice to over 130,000 global members on automation, enterprise AI, and digital transformation. We're live Wednesdays at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific on LinkedIn and YouTube, and the audio recording is available wherever you get your podcasts. And now, here's your host, Dan Goodstein.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Digital Leader Show. Today, we're discussing the art of stakeholder whispering, plus headlines for digital leaders from the world of enterprise technology. My co-host today is Chris Cerdak, award-winning author, former White House Chief Transformation Office Advisor, partner for digital transformation at Gartner, and AI practice lead at EY. He's authored 3 books, including The Care and Feeding of Bots, Data Crush, and Jerk, the 12 Steps to Rule the World. Chris, how's it going, buddy? Happy post-Thanksgiving.
Yeah, welcome to December. Year's almost over.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Although there's this great thing, if you haven't seen it, I think it's the Jimmy Kimmel show where he does these clips from all of the newscasters across the country saying how surprised they are that it's December, and the King always sneaks up on them every year, like it doesn't come on the same day every year. But yeah, it just feels like we were just talking end of summer, and here we are talking 2026.
Yeah, well, where I am in Southern California, we get about a 60-degree temperature shift in 6 weeks. So it's pretty radical.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, we have that here in New York, although we've gone from like cold in the daytime and cold at night and warm in the day to just cold. So feels like holidays, feels like New York winter, and so we're getting down to the final stretch here. I know we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening for next year, but let's jump into headlines. I mean, the one that kind of got my attention this morning, Chris, and this has been in the news a lot, obviously, but the jobs front, according to ADP, basically shocked everybody. The U.S. labor market took a unexpected hit caused by private companies cutting 32,000 jobs. This in contrast to some economists predicting a gain of 40,000 jobs. So big adjustment to expectations.
Well, and that's in particular coming into the holiday season where you always get the seasonality labor demand bump. So yeah, it's definitely worrying. And I think there's some of the latent effects of both trade issues, tariffs, because I was in Mexico recently and the whole discussion on there was around tariffs. And then just the economy weakening in general. I doubt that this is like the end of it. And it's particularly hard coming into the holiday season because people are counting on those paychecks coming in. So with luck, we'll have a bit of a bounce come the new year. We'll see.
There's an interesting element of it, like a lot of stories. If you get beyond the headline, the steepest decline came from businesses with 50 or fewer employees, and actually larger businesses actually had a net gain of 90,000 workers. So interesting. Seems like more of a hit on the SMB space. I wonder if you have any thoughts as to why that may be.
Well, that kind of leads into the where do you who can survive sort of an economic slowdown? A bigger companies simply by size and mass can potentially survive it better, whereas smaller companies, are running more razor thin margin sort of thing, and that's where they can kind of they're forced to make the change. But then every person you cut loose from a smaller firm is a bigger proportion of your total labor capacity. So it's really a mixed blessing. They can adjust their cost basis pretty quickly by cutting 1 or 2 people, but that also has a more significant impact on their capacity to operate. So if we look at smaller businesses as being the real engine of economic growth and activity in our country, that's more worrying than having up, 2/3 as many people doing Zoom calls every day at a Fortune 200.
Yeah, the other thing that kind of entered my mind, I had a conversation with a friend who's an HR executive for a bunch of big companies, and she said something. She works with a lot of PEs and VC firms and stuff, and she said to me something interesting, which is that some of these companies, and I imagine this affects the SMB space more than the large enterprise, but they're just becoming over leveraged. They just keep taking on investment dollars and loans and at some point that stuff starts getting pulled. People get nervous and they're just over leveraged. So I wonder if that's part of the culprit there. We've talked about the kind of AI boom and just where we are with this stuff. I wonder if there's something to some of the financial, you always say kind of what's the term you use, the financial gymnastics that the companies play.
Well, I forget the exact number, but something like 40% of the Fortune 500 are so-called zombie companies, where their debt load, their cash flow doesn't match their debt load, and so as you say, they're financing their mere existence. And as the money supply sort of gets crunched a little bit, then that all of a sudden you're negative to the point where you can't recover from it. Also, big companies have more access to credit and liquidity than small companies do. So whereas I don't know, Citibank can go out and come up with another billion here, a billion there to keep their operations going. Dick's Towing down the road can't do that. So they got to let someone go. Yeah. The other issue, I think, in smaller companies in smaller areas, there's more of a cascading effect. If that guy running the tow truck for Dick's Towing all of a sudden doesn't have a job, then the local grocery store loses some of their revenue and stuff. So there's more of a cascading effect, I think, with these smaller businesses, which is potentially more worrying. I don't know.
Yeah. Interesting. McKinsey's shaking up the business model, the consulting business model, which we've been scratching our heads at for a bit, Chris. They're adopting to a performance-based pricing model with fees that are contingent on outcomes. It's finally happening.
Yeah. So in my 30 plus years of being in and around that business, we always talked about it. But I mean, the entire machine is oriented towards the billable hour and so forth. So how do you get the entire machine to operate differently? It's sort of like trying to get an oil tanker boat to start flying. It's not built for purpose. But then the second question is, and having done these analytics for, again, a third of a century, who are you going to trust when it comes down to the performance metrics? Right. So if I'm going to pay you for performance, who's measuring the performance and hence getting paid? So there's a really, really perverse incentive there for you're going to go to McKinsey to say, how well did we do? And they're likely to say, you did fantastic. So I think it's the right move to a certain extent, but how you implement it with a business whose entire model for almost a century has been, billable hours and so forth, it's going to be a neat trick for them to pull out. But I think it's somewhat inevitable, and it's going to be more so the case across a lot of professional services.
Yeah, I've always been kind of interested in that model. Why you hire somebody by the hour to fix a problem without they have an incentive to not fix, right? But so maybe now they have an incentive to fix. But you bring up a good point, which is who decides on the measurements. You're reminding me of a roundtable we had years and years ago in the outsourcing days where a vendor that shall not be named and an executive at McDonald's was at one of our events arguing about who should pay for innovation and how you should measure innovation and whose innovation it is, and it's not quite so black and white, right?
Well, it's sort of a strange parallel, but I think of, like, was it Joseph Stalin that said, "Show me the person, and I'll show you the crime." So I can throw you out in a gulag on whether or not you're guilty. It's sort of like show me the payoff, and I'll build the Excel model to make it so.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the AI race heats up. OpenAI seems, according to some reports, to be concerned that they're falling behind with some of the new releases from Google Gemini and others. So apparently Sam Altman sent out a internal memo basically saying all hands on deck, no time off, and stop doing whatever else you're doing because we got to make ChatGPT faster, more reliable, more personalized, et cetera, et cetera. And this is as I think they have it. I think Google's now embedded Gemini into Chrome. And Anthropic is making moves towards an IPO, apparently.
Well, it said code red, all hands on deck. It sounds like he had ChatGPT write it for him, which he probably did. Yeah, it was just random sayings that it picked up from its training. The people that analyze this, it's actually quite interesting. Where OpenAI, you'd think there'd be a tighter correlation and integration with Microsoft, their parent, because Microsoft is everywhere, and you're never going to disembed Microsoft. But that's sort of the advantage that Google has, is that when they deploy their stuff, if they plug it into the back end of Google, everybody's still Googling stuff. I've seen some people make the commentary, well, OpenAI now has, was it 400 million users or something like that? Well, yeah, because it's not only free, it's 95% subsidized. The minute you start actually charging people what it's potentially worth, nobody's going to use it. And then there's also the recent release where they're showing that they're going to start posting ads in their posts, and you can be sure that those are going to be incredibly invasive ads based upon the dynamic conversation you think you're having with ChatGPT at the time. So again, we're used to having sort of the first three Google results be bought and paid for in advertising. That'll be a new idiom for people with OpenAI to get used to with OpenAI. So the cause of the panic is less important than the fact that there is panic. And it'll be interesting to see, what subsequent funding rounds are going to look like when he inevitably goes out to try to get more funding.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because there's kind of this race to be the app, the place where you search, if we could even use that term now. I had downloaded a couple months back, the Comet browser from Perplexity. And that was interesting because it was the first time I really changed my default app to browse the internet and ask questions and search and things like that. And it's the first time I think I've been off Chrome, and I can't think about how long since I've been a Chrome user. And you have more and more of these kind of things coming up and fighting for positioning and on your phone or wherever the killer app is that you initiate your research or your searches or what have you. This Anthropic IPO, they're saying could be one of the biggest ever. They're talking about valuations of like 300 billion, and interestingly beating OpenAI to the punch.
I'm gonna reinforce how old I really am. I remember was it Time Warner that bought AOL in 2000, and it was the biggest acquisition ever. I mean, I'm having massive Groundhog's Day deja vu all over again. Could it happen, and would it be the largest IPO ever? Probably. Is there a good chance that it'll crash just like AOL did shortly after it was bought in 2000? Yeah, better than 50-50, I think. We'll see.
Yeah, AOL, I think we had on the show a few weeks ago. They just finally got rid of the rest of their...
Yeah, right. So took 25 years to finally kill it off, but it certainly wasn't a good purchase mere months after they did it back then. So, it'd be, and who has the liquidity right now to pay that much? It'll be interesting to see.
So I want to get to our guest for today. It's kind of the human side of things for a change. We spend so much time talking about AI, but excited to have our guest, Bill Shanders, with us today. He's the author of Stakeholder Whispering. He's got 30 years of experience in information design, data storytelling, and visualization. He's the founder of Beehive Media, has worked with a variety of organizations, Fortune 500 and government alike. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
So I have to ask you how you got into this space. It's really interesting, as we talked about before, a couple different angles I want to ask you about. But how did you find yourself? How did you become the stakeholder whisperer?
Well, it's funny. You were talking about McKinsey before. One of my very first clients was actually McKinsey a very, very long time ago. I had a lot of consulting firms as clients, and I was doing web design and development in the early years. And kind of like the AI crazy hype cycle right now, at the time, everybody would just show up and say, we need a website, just make a website, and just throw a website together. But they weren't really thinking about like why and how and who's going to look at this thing. What do you want them to do when they get there, et cetera. And so, I was doing this kind of work for people who were usually thoughtful and strategic about how they worked. And suddenly they weren't. And so long story short, I've been doing stakeholder whispering my entire career. And I think it's what's actually that made the difference for me in my career. Like the idea that clients hire me to do X, but X, the technical skills, what I really do for a living, sort of on paper, isn't as important as that therapy session, that conversation with them where I help them figure out what they really need before I actually do it. So that's how I got here is probably largely because working in consulting firms, I got up close and personal with these kinds of people, but I've been doing it for a very, very long time. And like I said, it's more important than the technical stuff that I actually do.
So, you said something interesting to me before we went on live. I was thinking of this from the standpoint of, how to communicate with stakeholders and influence within the organization. And I want to talk about that. But you said something kind of interesting, which is, part of the time stakeholders don't even know what they're asking for and what they need. So what does that entail?
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea. So, I know you talk about digital transformation, right? So think about how many digital transformation projects are just a disaster. Or you were just talking about the Time Warner AOL purchase, right? We do things, it's part of like an automated response. We're driven by our subconscious at all times. This is proven by decades of psychological research. And so in the work world, the example is, okay, hey, there's these new things out called CRMs or ERPs or LMSs or whatever it is. Let's do it. We need one of those because I heard our competitors have one of those. And so everyone marches ahead and they spend millions of dollars and they pay the consultants $1 gazillion and they spend a year or 3 years launching some giant system and it's an utter failure 90% of the time. And it's because no one said, well, gee, why are we doing this? What is the point? I mean, instead of being driven by that automated response, let's think it through and think about what we're actually trying to solve for and then focus on that. So, it's just a fact of life that humans are driven by their subconscious at all times, or we're driven by, competitive instinct or whatever other reasons. And our job is to slow it down and just be a little bit more strategic, a little bit more thoughtful about what we're doing and why we're doing it before we start doing it.
Imagine that, right? Yeah, I think we live in this this world where I read this book a few months back about deep work, this term deep work, and how basically nobody does it anymore because we're just in this reactive environment all the time of, answering emails and putting out fires and things. How do you create a culture around that? Or if you're an employee, how do you kind of see if that culture is going to exist, or do you just have to deal with these difficult stakeholders and the way they're doing things?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, it is definitely true that some companies have a culture where this is accepted, embraced even, and they really thrive on, hey, let's be thoughtful and really make sure we're doing the right thing. Other cultures are definitely a top down, just do what I say and don't, shut up about it already. So, what I say is that, test for it, right? So the next time your boss or your client asks you to do something, ask one question, right? The one question is, tell me more. It could be as simple as that. Tell me more about this request you're asking of me. And maybe they expand a little bit on it. And from there, you have a little bit more information. Or another question that's a good one is, how are we going to measure success? Now, this is interesting because you were just talking about that with McKinsey. Suddenly there is pay for performance. And not only, to your point, depends on who's measuring, right? And if they're reporting on their measurements, that's a problem. On top of that, there's a very famous quote, you can't manage what you don't measure. And that actually is not what was actually said. The actual quote, and I'm going to get it wrong also, but directionally accurate. The quote actually is more, we'll manage to whatever we measure. And the point that he was making when he said that is that whatever you decide to measure, that's what you're going to optimize for. So McKinsey, whatever they decide to measure, even if the company's going to do the measuring themselves, they're going to optimize for solving that and boosting those numbers. And so, when you're in the business world and your boss says do X, and you say, well, how are we going to measure success? Well, then now suddenly you're going to be oriented towards optimizing for that. But even that question should have a follow-up like, okay, well, why are we measuring for that? So, you got to test the waters, and you'll discover whether your boss is whisperable, as I call it. And honestly, like the short answer is if your boss isn't whisperable, then you probably should find a new boss, because it's going to be a happier, healthier, and more productive work environment when you work somewhere where that is the culture of the organization.
Chris, you spent a lot of time in these types of environments. Are you able to tell right away when you speak to a stakeholder? What, is it that black and white, or what was your experience?
Well, Bill's spot on a bunch of stuff here. The thing that immediately came to mind is I ride motorcycles, and the first thing they teach you is if there's like a tree around the corner or there's a rock in the road, don't look at it, because if you stare at it, you're going to hit it. And to your point, like if I set up a metric, I'm going to hit that metric, even if it's not good for me. And I've often said transformation is in the metrics you're not making right now, not in the ones that you are. Right. So, and I get the sense, Bill, that's, and then the other thing is, as you were talking, that comes to mind is back in the 90s, we would talk about the 5 whys. Can you answer why you're doing what you're doing at least 5 times? And most people can't get past 2 or 3. And that's very telling as to who is a stakeholder, and are they, to your point, are they whisperable?
Yeah. Yeah. The 5 whys are great. I talk about that in the book. And the basic idea, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, you're asking why, and the first answer is a surface level answer, and the next why, and the next why. Eventually, you get to the real root cause of the issue. But Chris, to your point, I was looking you up on LinkedIn, and I noticed you actually, in your banner on LinkedIn, you have one of the greatest data visualizations of all time, which is the survivor bias visual. And for those of you who don't know the story, it's a picture of an airplane, and it has a bunch of dots, which represent where this plane, World War II. This is a true story from World War II. Where the plane got shot. And so the basic idea is these planes would come back, the mechanics would notice all the holes, and then they would try to figure out what to do about that. And the answer was, oh, well, look at all the holes in the tips of the wings or on like the tail. We should put armor there because we're obviously getting shot a lot there. But that's the exact opposite logic, because those are the planes that made it back. In other words, the plane can fly just fine if it has a bunch of holes in the tips of the wings and in the tail. Where you don't see any holes, those are the planes that probably didn't make it back. So to Chris's point, it's the data you're not thinking about. It's where you're not looking that you have to be really thoughtful about. And that's our job as stakeholder whisperers, is to say, okay, I heard you ask for X. I know that everybody's doing X. The normal thing is to do X. I wonder if there's something other than X that we should be thinking about.
Not exactly. Well, and for me, that came from my time building spacecraft, where it's, half of mission success is not failing. And we spent so much time, we had a bunch of engineers that were trying to get to Mars, and I was the guy that said, okay, don't blow up along the way. And so generally speaking, if you're failing at the stuff that you're concentrating on, then you're just incompetent. If you're failing at the stuff that you didn't concentrate on, that's your opportunity.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example.
So Bill, how do we do this in practice though? I mean, we live in a corporate world where everything is KPIs and dashboards and reports, and our audience is largely technical people, largely data people. So it's like it's data analysis paralysis sometimes. Do we just have to split the difference, or does that not work at all? How do you kind of figure out the mixture of reading between the lines and data that's really not data, but it's more information, to your point?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that, data people of all people should realize that data is inherently flawed, right? There is no such thing as perfect data. And so, we know the numbers we're getting from here, and here are missing stuff, or we've analyzed it from a certain perspective, et cetera. There's all kinds of biases at play, conscious and subconscious. And so our data is imperfect. That doesn't mean we don't use it. Of course, we got to use it. But it means, allow ourselves to recognize that everything has gray area, and to essentially question everything. I call it, engage your useful paranoia, be a little bit paranoid. What's wrong with this data? What's wrong with these decisions I'm making? What's wrong with this plan? And probe it, just investigate it, ask a few questions. And that includes even when you have, okay, we have these KPIs and we have these KPIs for a reason. Like, we have quarterly results and, the market is watching, blah, blah, blah. All right. But you know what? Next quarter, maybe the KPIs need to shift. And the best example I can give is, remember COVID? In COVID, all of a sudden, every dashboard in the entire corporate world was useless when COVID hit. Because instead of, if we're below 3% growth or, below 2% growth, it's a disaster. Well, then it was, if you were above negative 10% growth, you were like heroes, right? So you got to change your thresholds. You always got to be dynamic and be able and willing to adjust your perspective and what you're shooting for and how you're shooting for it. So, again, data people should be more aware of this than anybody. We sometimes get hyper-focused on the numbers, but remember that all data is flawed. It's all gray area. So take a step back and just question everything a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
If I could, I mean, Bill, you're spot on with COVID, because at the time I was dealing with a bunch of companies trying to do logistics modeling, and they said, well, how do we do any modeling in the middle of the pandemic and everything's all topsy turvy? I said, go to your noisiest data, go to your most abnormal data. Because you're in an abnormal situation, the more you use the normal stuff that drove your business for the last decade, the farther off you're going to be.
Yeah.
And so this is one of the challenges with like data cleansing. When I'm cleansing this so-called bad data, I'm eliminating the ability to answer a different question.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. And like, in the normal world, this is the threshold. Well, it'll be between here and here. And the noisy data makes it look like that. Well, guess what? That is reality at that moment. So yeah, that's the gray area. Live in it. It's going to be painful, but you got to acknowledge the reality for sure.
And how do you kind of take that data, figure out what is, the actionable part or the relevant part, and kind of do that storytelling, Bill? Because I think that's such a great trait that you talk about, right? It's one thing to get all these. I mean, I get all these automated reports in my inbox that I just delete because I don't know what they are or what they're actually telling me, right? Or what I'm supposed to take away from them. So, how do you figure out what to take away from them, and then maybe more importantly, craft that story, do that storytelling around it?
I mean, this gets back to how you introduced this, right? The basic idea is we're now back in the human element of things, and whether it's an automated report that, some software system where some thresholds were checkbox were checked and thresholds were set and every Monday it goes out, or it's an AI generated report, AI and or automation doesn't know what you actually need. And it also doesn't know the context of the data. This week, our biggest issue in our company is retention. We had, 47 people quit last week in one department. Oh my God, what the hell's going on over there? Next week, the issue will be like some logistical challenge. And the week after that, it'll be about et cetera. So, context is what it's all about. And so, even though AI or automated systems can understand concept and spit out that, here's the most urgent thing this week based on the numbers, it doesn't know what you, Dan or Chris, needs from that or it could, but we don't set up our systems smartly enough to do it that way. Long story short, big picture is it always circles back to stakeholder whispering, because I, as a human, can be empathetic with you, Dan, and understand what you in your role and what I know is going on in the rest of your business, what you need from me today. And so I can tell you the story oriented towards what you need. Because storytelling, it's not just putting a narrative together so the information flows, although that's a really key part of storytelling, but it's about knowing which story you need to hear. And it's not the story I want to tell. I'm not manipulating the numbers for my own benefit, but it's what do you need from me today? And what you need is going to be based on me having these stakeholder whispering conversations with you so I understand what's driving you. What are your concerns? What's your context in addition to the context of the data itself?
We live in this era now where a good chunk of the workforce has never been in a traditional work environment, at least the way the three of us, I think, would define it pre-2020, right? I mean, there's an entire part of the workforce that has almost entirely worked remote or hybrid. What's your advice for them, just to influence stakeholders, to get FaceTime with stakeholders, to advance within the org. Because it used to be you walk down the hallway, you bumped into your boss, you had an opportunity you're in the elevator, right? You had your opportunity. You had all these Steve Jobs stories of him catching people in the elevator and him making promotions or firing people based on what they told him in an elevator, right? You don't have that the way you used to, right? So how do you do that in this virtual world?
Yeah, man, it's so hard. Zoom came along, COVID hit, Zoom was there, and it worked incredibly well. It surprised most of us how easily we could shift to a remote only world. And, I teach workshops, clients hire me to teach them data storytelling and visualization. And literally on Sunday afternoon, my client Starbucks said, don't come tomorrow for the workshop tomorrow. I was supposed to fly in that night. And so they said, but we're going to put you on Zoom. So literally with less than 24 hours notice, I had to do the full workshop virtually. And it worked okay. It really was not horrible. But here's the key issue is that, body language obviously goes away, and even eye contact goes away, right? I'm looking at the camera so that you feel like I'm looking at you, but guess what? I can't look at you if I'm looking at the camera. So it's certainly not two-way eye contact, although it can sort of feel that way. And without eye contact, you're not reading what's really going on. You're not seeing facial expressions. You're not getting all those little cues that help us really understand things. Add on top of that, there's serendipitous crossings in the cafeteria or the elevator. It just doesn't happen. So the short answer is you know what? Go to the office sometimes. Or if you're a leader, organize quarterly or semi-yearly events where people can actually get together face to face. If it's an all remote company, then you just do the best you can and you try to have, really human conversations rather than just a quick stand up, update, which is, doesn't work even in person. I would argue, try to have real conversations. And again, when you're the person being assigned a task, do your best to really engage and don't just take what somebody says with as like, essentially like, the edict from up top and run with it. Always question everything. And again, depending on the patience and how whisperable your boss is, you're gonna have to sort of find that, that fine line between annoying your stakeholder and getting the information that you need. But start off slow, take small bites of the apple. But if you're reared in an all remote environment, it's gonna be hard. It's not as easy as in person. You just got to do the best you can. And that's lame advice, but it's unfortunately all I can give you.
Yeah. But so, I'm curious, you're running these workshops in these courses. Are there any particular kind of points where you see kind of the aha moment, especially for people that are not normally visual learners, visual thinkers? Anything pop out in particular?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that I teach that are always aha moments. When it comes to the visual component of things, my favorite thing to teach is something called pre-attentive processing. We know from psychology, from research on human visual perception, that you'll react to a visual in an instant. It's literally subconscious. It's so fast. Once you understand that, then that makes the case for making visuals very, very, very simple. Minimal design. And you have complex data. You're making a really complex chart. There's a big story to tell. It cannot be the simplest chart in the world. Okay, fine. But I'm going to design it as simply as possible. I'm going to take all the color out. I'm going to take as much distracting information off of it. And the one thing that I need you to see, and by the way, this gets back to the storytelling. What do you need, Dan, right now about this data? Because I've whispered you, I know what you need. That's the only part that's going to be in color, bold, and with a giant arrow pointing at it. So visual perception being incredibly fast, pre-attentive, allows me to design in a very simple way. It requires that I design that way. So that's one thing that I teach that is usually, and especially the way I demonstrate it, really life-altering for people when they're doing data visualization, because I'll walk through like a chart where I took the original chart, which is a complete hot mess, and then the final version of which it actually tells the story of that data effectively. And I do it step by step by step by simply removing stuff for the most part And by the end, it's like, oh yeah, that's why a good chart usually looks like that and not like that disaster that we started with.
What I love about that is I'm a marketing go-to-market guy by trade originally, right? So a lot of the work I do formally and informally is helping tech companies that have long lists of features and stuff, and try to get it down to a simple pitch, right? And it's exactly what you're talking about, right? It's whether it's an image or slides or a bunch of text on a website, it's getting it from the 40-page version to what's the one thing you do really, really well, the proverbial elevator pitch, I guess, or what a third grader would understand. But what's great about that is in that process, you learn a lot, and they learn a lot about what their value proposition actually is. The exercise of creating the image is almost, to me, as valuable or more valuable than the image itself, because it forces you to kind of work through it at a level of detail that most companies that I've worked with haven't done.
Yeah. I mean, and by the way, that's simultaneously sort of like the 5 whys. It's also, it's stakeholder whispering. What it's all about is it's like therapy. So like, let's take that example. You have a deck and it's trying to convince, some giant corporation to buy your SaaS product, whatever it is. All right. Well, why is it 60 pages? What is it? If I only gave you one thing to say, what would you say? Then they say like one sentence, the elevator pitch. Could this deck be literally that one sentence on a slide? Well, no, because we need to say these other 4 things for regulatory purposes and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Well, can we say 3 of those 4 things? The way I always phrase it is, what if you defaulted to no? What if instead of putting all 60 pages out there and just selectively trimming it back, what if we started out with the most minimal thing we could possibly think of, that one sentence, and only add in what must be added in? And if we take that approach, you're going to be a much more effective communicator. But to your point, the process of thinking it through will clarify your own thinking on what you do, how you do it, et cetera. It's literally like therapy. And that's what stakeholder whispering is always about. It's this therapeutic process to help your stakeholders figure out, what do they need? What do they really need to do here? And then everything else is just garbage, noise. And so ignore it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I spent the early part of my career in the newspaper business. I think this always came natural to me. It was kind of the same thing. Like when you wrote something, you had to front load it, right? You had to put the really important information in the front. You can always go deeper. You can always go longer. You can always explain further. You can always go more into data, whatever have you. But you had to be prepared for the fact that if the editor cut it to 3 paragraphs, that the important stuff made the cut, right? And it's kind of like that with marketing, maybe with storytelling as well. People can always ask questions. You can go to the deeper, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 37. But what's that one thing, or the first 3 paragraphs that are going to get somebody's attention, right?
Yeah. Trained as a journalist also. So 100% with you on that. And on top of, the editor might cut it, the reader isn't going to read more than the first 3 paragraphs anyways. You got to always assume that. So for both reasons, 100%.
I mean, I don't know what if they track stats back then, but I wonder what the percentage of people was that would actually go to it said story continues on page 47. Did people actually flip through the paper and go to page 47? Because I never did. I didn't have the attention span for it.
Yeah, that's right. If only we had click-through metrics back then on those.
I think a lot of people are blown away by the concept that there was this before times when humanity didn't have PowerPoint and we still managed to communicate effectively. In fact, arguably more effectively. And I always go back to as what makes us, I think, unique as a species is tools, but we're not the only one that uses tools, but also storytelling. So for tens of thousands of years, the way that we communicated anything with each other was through stories. That was the collective memory of our species. And I think if you can plug in effective storytelling, which I think is what you're talking about with stakeholder narrative, that sits with us at a very deep primal level. And I think that's how you get people to be more into whatever it is you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots and lots of research that shows that story is what we remember. Mm-hmm. There was one study done a few years ago where they were essentially doing a fundraiser and they sent people different brochures. Some people got a brochure that was all stats and other people got a brochure that had stories. And the story brochure raised more money and it was the part that people remembered. And those two things are probably correlated. On top of that, there's actually some people who have made a pretty compelling case to say that storytelling is actually more important than opposable thumbs as an evolutionary imperative. That literally the survival of the human species relies more on storytelling than it does on some of the other things we would think of. Because how did we learn how to hunt buffalo? Well, people would go and hunt buffalo and then would come back to the village and they would explain, and it was data, by the way, it was a data information, how many arrows they carried, how many arrows they ran, mileage, how many buffalo there were, et cetera. But that data was was communicated in the form of a story. So we remember the story, which means we learn how to do things like hunt buffalo. Really important.
It's all people. To your point, people remember stories. They can't tell you, these stats, which you would think would be really important. I always go through this myself. Like, I'll hear stats. I'll be reading something or listening to Audible or whatever, and I'll hear this stat. I'm like, wow, that's a great stat. That's an amazing stat. And I even give myself I want to remember this stat. Maybe it's just me, dude. I'm dyslexic or whatever. And then the next day, I'm like, oh, I had that stat. I can't remember it because there's no story attached to it, right? But when you hear a story, I can tell you where I was on my walk when I heard that story, and I flash back to that moment, and I remember all of this stuff I was thinking at that time. It's an amazing thing, and we see it in marketing too. Like we're at the point where we almost exclusively force our members to, when they publish content, to publish case studies, not just thought leadership, not just, miscellaneous content, case studies, because it's essentially storytelling, right? It's talking about how a customer had a problem and how you solved that problem. And it's a story.
Yeah. And the thing is, stories trigger an emotional response. And when you literally feel it, that's memorable. A number 42. Okay. Well, whatever, 42, but what does 42 mean? What was the impact of 42? That's much more impactful.
Chris, you've written a couple books too. I mean, you've seen this play out, yeah?
I fold it into everything I do with my own company and my team. I say theme, team, and tech in that order. That's what you have to prioritize, whether you're talking to employees, investors, customers. It's that theme, the storytelling part of it, that's going to make the connection with any of them. And then, Bill, I love you mentioned it before, context is everything. The same story isn't going to have the same effect on each person. So you need to tailor the messaging to the individual to get them individually engaged, to have them have that emotional response, as you mentioned a moment ago, Bill.
Yeah. And it's interesting, that's sort of like the promise of AI, right? Like AI can know what Chris needs today, what Dan needs today, what Bill needs. And it could theoretically send us each an individual message based on the same data, based on the same whatever, but it's not really doing that. But if and when it does, that's going to be pretty powerful automation. Maybe some of the stuff I mentioned earlier almost goes away. I don't think so still, because, I think that context can only go so far without that human understanding of, well, what does that mean for that human on the other side? I think there's always going to be a psychological component to it. But that ultra personalization is one of those promises that maybe can start to deliver on some of the promise that tech has been, shouting about for the last few years.
Well, and Dan, this is a favorite of mine. I've been arguing all along that transformers inherently strip context out of language. So I actually shudder to think, Bill, that we actually figure out the technology to do that, because when we can take an AI and have it be context sensitive, like you just described, then we're probably in real trouble. We're all going to be plugged into the matrix and we won't know it.
Yeah, definitely true.
So, Bill, one final one, if you could maybe leave our listeners, our viewers, with some final advice for anybody that's watching that's kind of stuck in a messy stakeholder dynamic, competing priorities, last minute changes, other than quit their jobs. What are a few simple behaviors they can try this week to be more of a shareholder whisperer?
I think it really mostly comes down to, first of all, recognizing that these people exist, and I do talk about that in the book. I have a chapter about the trouble you run into, and I sort of name a few of the characters, like the passive aggressive leader or whoever, the kinds of people who might be unwhisperable or less whisperable. Recognize it. And yes, if you can move on, please do. But if you can't, then, take small bites of the apple. The fact is, even your most difficult stakeholders would prefer that you do a good job than that you execute on some stupid task that ends up wasting a ton of money and a ton of time and gets them in trouble with their stakeholders. Because don't forget, your stakeholder has stakeholders, right? So take small bites of the apple. Can you get an hour-long meeting every time your boss asks you to do something? Probably not. And will it be a productive meeting? Maybe not. But can you get 5 minutes? Can you get that one question of additional clarity addressed? And then by the way, when you do that, the whole thing is about building trust. Once you've done that and you've delivered a better experience because of that, then the next time you might get 2 or 3 questions in. And before you know it, you have hour-long meetings every time because your stakeholder begins to recognize how good you are at this and how much of a difference that it makes. So, recognize it and take small bites of the apple is probably the best short advice I can give.
Great advice, Bill. Thank you so much. Where can people find you? Where can they buy the book?
I'm always available on my website, billshander.com. There's a link to the book there. And of course, it's on Amazon and everywhere else you can find books these days.
Sounds good. Bill, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. It was fun.
Thank you.
Chris, good conversation. I promise I'm not trying to find people that agree with you. In fact, I'm trying the opposite. I'm trying to find people that don't agree with you. But I'm starting to learn that you were right about a lot of things.
It's selection bias. Maybe that airplane thing that we were discussing, where I just have more holes than most people. But he's spot on. The more we're counting on automation and the technology and so forth, the more the human aspects are going to be the determinant of who succeeds and not. I think back to ERP. Everybody needed ERP because it gave you world-class processes. But if your processes are like everyone else's, then there's nothing to differentiate you. So I think we're heading down that sort of path even faster now. And whatever that last percentage of your organization that can touch on people's human aspects, that's what's going to differentiate you.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll be back Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. In the meantime, if there's anything that you're working on, you need some help, some advice, please go to irpaai.org. You can reach out to us there. In the meantime, have a great week. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, take care, Dan.